this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Benjamin Franklin. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Life Burst podcast. It's me, Tiffany. Hello. Hi. Surprise. Today, we're going to be going over the Umr deck list that we have prepared. We decided to go with an Umr Death and Taxes build, and I'm going to be sharing that one with you guys today. So let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so we made a couple builds of Umr to start. And the first one was an Umr Tempo. We decided to go with kind of a more true to form red, green, blue Ancient Surprise style deck with Worlds Reverse, but we found that ironically enough, even with the red splash, it just did not have the kind of push we needed to win certain matches. So we built a Umr control deck that leaned a little bit more into that. And unfortunately, this just couldn't really last for the longer games, which is unfortunate because that's kind of what the meta is doing right now. So we ended up building a Umr Taxes deck where we're really leaning into it, but we've got our own spin going on. And we've play tested this a couple times. Honestly, me personally, I really like the way that this deck operates. But it seems to do fairly well in other matchups, and it plays very consistently and balanced overall. So let's get into the first thing. Obviously, Umr is going to be your center, and she reads, Auto, at the beginning of your attack phase, you may swap the positions of 2 target signi on your field. And enter ability is look at your opponent's hand and choose a card. Put that card on the bottom of its owner's deck. And then her once a game is put 1 Hastalic on one of your opponent's Signy zones. So first things first, the enter ability of this is great because you get to look at your opponent's entire hand. So yeah, you can choose a card and put that on the bottom of your opponent's deck. But don't forget, you do get to look at the entirety of your opponent's hand. So you can start planning your turns out from your level 3 grow very easily. It's quite handy. And the auto ability, at the beginning of your attack phase, you may swap positions of any 2 target signi on your field. This is also very nice for when you are trying to, well, there's certain abilities that signis have that will activate when they are switched lanes. But also this is very good for building up a catch-22 scenario with your opponent. The most important thing about this level 3 Larig, of course, though, is the Hastalic token. So what is Hastalic, really quick? Hastalic is a token that is placed on one of your opponent's Signy zones, and it stays there for the rest of the game. So, in our opinion, there is no reason to wait on using your once a game ability. It lasts for the rest of the game. And you can tell this because it does not say until end of turn anywhere on either of these cards. So when you want to put a Hastalic on the center of your opponent's field on the center zone, it's going to stay on the center zone for the rest of the game. But of course you can also choose the left lane or the right lane for the Hastalic token. The Hastalic token itself says, Auto, at the beginning of your attack phase, banish Signy in the Signy zone unless your opponent discards a card or pays 1 colorless. In parentheses it says, the auto ability activates during the attack phase of the player who placed it. So, a couple things to go over. This is kind of it's not the heart and soul of Death and Taxes, Umr, but it's definitely something that we were like, well, what if we leaned into this even more? So this is a attack phase trigger, which means that as the active player of Umr, when it's your attack phase, don't forget that your auto abilities go into a bucket of so-called, and then you can choose the order that they are resolved in. If you want to know more information about this, you can go to our latest rules clarification video with Neat, and they can tell you all about it there. So for instance, you actually have two attack phase auto abilities with these two cards right here. So you have the auto ability from the Umr level 3 Lyrig herself, as well as the Hastalic. So you can choose for your opponent to either pay for the Hastalic first, or you can swap positions of your Signies on the field first. So that's the other thing that you want to consider with these. The last thing I want to say about this is a fun fact about Hastalic. Hastalic is a eldritch god of sorts, because you know everything for Ancient Surprise is related to Cthulhu, eldritch horror type beings. And Hastalic is the being of plagues and illness. So if you have trouble remembering that Hastalic stays on the field for the rest of the game and only affects one Signy zone, think of it like you're putting a plague on a Signy zone of your choice. I don't know. Fun. Moving on. Here are some of the pieces and assists that we've chosen for this deck. Of course, we've got our typical Akino lineup with Akino Rock and Akino Bye Bye. Then we've also splashed in Madoka, so we've got Madoka Float, and we've also got Madoka Break. So with Madoka Float, what we've got is discard a card and draw 3 cards. This is really great for fixing your hand, especially if you mulligan a terrible starting hand. This is coming in to save the day. And then we have Madoka Break, which can help with removal. This is going to be one that you're going to want to wait until kind of the last minute to grow. And it's going to be one that you will want to pay the full abilities for, because there's not a whole lot of removal in this deck. So Madoka is going to be coming in to help you not only fix your hand, but also remove things later on in the field. We've also got Summer Live Blues. This is going to be your pay 2 blue to draw 2 cards, then put target Signy on your opponent's field to the bottom of its owner's deck. Again, good card draw and good removal. Main phase timing. We also have Burning Curiosity, which is the pay 1 colorless, and then you can choose to exceed 4 to either vanish target Signy or remove it from the game. This also has main phase timing as well. So as you can see, we're kind of building up our defenses with some removal in our Lyrig deck, and not so much maybe throughout the rest of the deck, as you'll see moving forward. So let's get into that, shall we? Starting with our level 1s, we've got Monomin, Zhaoyun, Clepsydra, and Haniel. So Monomin, some of you might not be familiar with, but this one has a pretty cool ability. It says, at the beginning of your attack phase, you may discard a card, and if you do, your opponent discards a card. So the whole idea with Death and Taxes for Umr is that we're always trying to make our opponent pay for something with their own resources. So Monomin is kind of the step 1 to that. We're saying, yeah, we're going to be discarding a card, but you also have to discard a card. So we're making our opponents pay by removing a card from their hand. And these are pretty great in either your first turn or on your second turn when you've kind of filled out your field a little bit more. Zhaoyun, always a staple. And Clepsydra is kind of a fun one, and I'll tell you why. So it says, when this Signy on your field moves to a different Signy zone by your effect, your opponent discards a card. And if you remember going back to Umr's level 3 Lyrig auto ability, you can switch lanes for 2 Signy on your field, which means that if you have a Clepsydra on your field and you move it, your opponent could discard a card later on in the game. I'm more than willing to admit that Clepsydra might not be the strongest level 1. We are also considering that Heket might actually be a better choice for this slot in the deck, and we are going to be playing with Heket instead of Clepsydra in the future. But for right now, this is the build that we have, although Heket might be a better choice for you. And of course, we have one Haniel for just a little bit more hand fixing. Never a bad option, especially with that life burst. For our level 2s, we're keeping it simple. We've got Bruno, Azure Angel, and Folklore, Azure Evil. With Bruno, it says constant as long as the Signy is in your center Signy zone, it gains whenever the Signy attacks, draw a card, and your opponent discards a card. So this is going to be kind of your main staple for your center Signy zone as long as you can help it, because once again we are taxing our opponent a card from their hand. Now Folklore, it doesn't have any sort of discard text, but I mean look at the life burst. Down up to 2 target Signy in your opponent's field and draw a card. And I have to tell you, in some of my matches that I've had, Folklore has come up often in my life cloth and has had impeccable timing. Moving on to our level 3s, we've got Hamlin, Master Trickster, Chandelier, and Penlight. So Hamlin is an interesting card. I'm gonna try and read this one as best as I can. It says, whenever the Signy attacks, your opponent discards 2 cards. Whenever the Signy attacks, your opponent may discard 2 cards. If they do, negate the attack. The second part of this is, at the beginning of your attack phase, you may pay 2 blue. If you do, turn target Signy in front of this Signy down at the end of this turn. Oh, sorry. I'm having... This one's a little complicated, so give me a moment. At the beginning of your attack phase, you may pay 2 blue. If you do, turn target Signy in front of this Signy face down. At the end of the turn, if a Signy is not in the same position as the Signy turned face down this way, turn that Signy face up. However, if there is a Signy in the same position, put that Signy turned face down this way into the trash. So with Hamlin, you're really only going to be focusing on the first text, which is that when the Signy attacks, your opponent discards 2 cards to negate the attack. But the second part is not the worst thing to have as well, because if you're willing to pay the 2 blue and your opponent doesn't necessarily have the ability to flip a life burst with something that would then fill a lane to go over top of the Signy that's been turned face down representing an open lane, then you're probably not gonna so much have to worry about the second half of the text on this card. I have found that paying the 2 blue in the late game, when your opponent is less likely to have the cards to discard to negate the attack, might be worth it for you, but for the most part, Hamlin Master Trickster is really supposed to be a larger, more difficult to deal with attacker that your opponent can tax themselves to prevent. I hope that makes sense. It's actually a really cool card. I love the art. Moving on to Chandelier Code Art. Many of you will be familiar with this one because it's actually in the Card Jockey starter deck, which is really something. This one says, constant use costs of your opponent's spells are increased by 1 colorless. Constant, as long as there is a spell in your trash, this Signy gets minus 3,000 power, and any Signy banished by this Signy gets put into the trash instead of the ender zone. It also has a life burst that says, add up to 1 target Signy and 1 target spell from your trash to your hand. This is actually a fantastic card, and here's why. If you're running a deck like this, you probably will be using spells. You'll probably use spells at least once a game, which means by the time that you're going to be putting out Chandelier to the field, it's going to be eligible for that plus 3,000, which makes this a 13,000 power Signy, which is absolutely huge. Not to mention it's got a little bit of Ender Denial in it because when this banishes a Signy, it's not going to put your opponent's Signy into their Ender zone, it's going to put them into the trash. So they will have less resources to pay your ever-growing taxes with. This is great. Not to mention there's just a little bit of extra tax on the top, saying that any of your opponent's spells are increased by an additional 1. The life burst ain't bad either because it doesn't specify that you can't get back a guard. So if you were to flip a Chandelier in your life burst, not only can you get back a guard, but you can also get back one of the 2 spells that we'll be going over later, which will be very, very good for you. The last level 3 that we've got is Penlight. Most of you will be familiar with this one. It says, at the beginning of your opponent's attack phase, target Lyrig on your opponent's field gains constant. This Lyrig cannot attack unless you pay 2 colorless until end of turn. It also has an additional auto at the end of your turn. If you have used a spell this turn, this Signy gains Shadow until the end of your opponent's next end phase. Life Burst is choose one, either draw a card or return target up Signy on your opponent's field to the owner's hand. So again, this is going to be your heavy taxer. I mean, anytime you see a Penlight fall into the field, you basically have to think to yourself, okay, I'm going to need at least 2 open energies to attack with my Lyrig. So that's the threat that Penlight is adding to the field, and the Life Burst ain't too bad either. Let's move on to some spells. We've got Ye Olde Random Drain, or Random Bad for those of you that prefer a more rough translation of the card. Draw a card and your opponent discards a card. This isn't an Uchu no Hajimari deck, so we won't be worrying about the team ability because it does not apply. However, paying 1 to draw a card and then have your opponent discard a card at the right time with this kind of deck is going to be very important. Because if your opponent has 2 cards in their hand and you play a Random Drain and then follow it up with a Hamlin, they're not going to be able to stop that attack. So that's just one of the ways that you can maximize your taxes on this deck. It also has a Life Burst, which is down target Signy on your opponent's field and freeze it. Your opponent discards a card. So either way you play this card, Random Drain, your opponent is going to have a very bad hand day. And downing and freezing your opponent's Signy, not a bad move, always welcome. We love to see any way that we can prevent damage coming from the opponent. Now, the next 2 is Hamlin's Step, which, yes, she is related to Hamlin Master Trickster. So Hamlin's Step is a 1 cost, or a 1 blue cost spell, and it says draw 2 cards and put up to 1 Hamlin Trickster from your hand onto the field. Then target Hamlin Trickster on your field. Oh, I think we have a train. Sorry, y'all. Then target Hamlin Trickster on your field, and it gains this Signy's attack cannot be negated by this Signy's effect until end of turn. So basically what that means is not only is this a pay 1 blue to draw 2, but you can also make your Hamlin Master Trickster the attacks unpreventable. So you're basically telling your opponent, yeah, I don't care if you discard 2 cards or not, the attack is still going to go through. So there's a lot of synergy in this deck that I have really enjoyed. A lot of little decisions that you have to make to really be able to maximize the taxes that you're placing on your opponent. As you guys have seen throughout the deck, there's a lot of maximizing on the discarding as a way to not only get cards out of your opponent's hand, but the less cards your opponent has in hand, not only the less cards do they have to play on the field, but the less cards are going to end up in their enter zone. So you're really taxing a lot of your opponent's resources with this deck. And that's one of the reasons why I find it very fun and interesting to play. This is a tempo deck, so it's not going to be like your typical control or mid-range deck. It's a tempo deck, so please keep that in mind when you are piloting this particular build. Throughout some of our playtesting, these are just some of the results that we have had up against other decks. White aggro is a big contender in the meta right now, and we have found it to be a fairly even matchup. It's somewhat to be expected because we do have a fair amount of white splashes in this deck, so they kind of operate the same. It might be a little bit of a toss-up between the Umr Death Taxes and White Aggro, but it should still come out to be a fairly challenging and fun game. It is favored against atomics, and it is also favored against discards. I would say it's favored against discards just because the discard build in this deck is a little bit heavier, but also there's a fair amount of draw power in it. So despite your opponent wanting to discard you down, you have a lot of options to be able to recur your hand later on in the game. Now, the difficult matchup that we've run into is of course the X red Enter Burn. Now, this is because there are quite a few things that we have to pay for in this deck, and having to manage our own resources while we're trying to tax our opponents can be quite tricky. It's not impossible, but it will be a more difficult matchup. So, with that said, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this recap of our build for the Umr Death Taxes. I have really enjoyed playing this deck, and I will be playing it more in the future. If you guys like this video, please comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts about this deck in the comment section down below. Or if you have a different build you would like to share, please let me know so I can playtest it myself. And of course, may you always flip a life burst. Bye!